This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Welcome to this podcast as part of the IIEA's Future-Proofing Europe project, supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Today, I'm joined by Mary Baker, Chair of the Electoral Commission and former judge of the Supreme Court. We're going to discuss the broad topics of electoral integrity and safeguarding democracy. These areas fall under the Future-Proofing Europe project's work strand on the EU Democracy Shield, which is a key part of the project in 2025. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you, Mary, and thank you for giving up your valuable time to come and discuss these topics with us today.
It's a good opportunity, actually, Dylan, to explain the general role of the Electoral Commission and to talk around the topics that are arising. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Perfect. And firstly, just to start off, could you explain for the listeners the role and powers of the Electoral Commission?
I could. We were established 2 years ago by the Act of 2022, and we are a statutory body, so our powers are constrained by the legislation, and we are essentially a body responsible for an oversight of electoral process, but we also have education and research roles. Plus, we have a number of roles that we took over from other ad hoc bodies. So we are the Referendum Commission. So it's our function to explain the subject matter of a referendum. It's our function to deal with the realignment of electoral boundaries, should that be necessary. And as you probably remember, we did that last year. We had a referendum last year. We had the role in that. We are also the register of political parties. And that might sound straightforward, but in fact, we do get appeals from decisions of the registrar regarding the registration of the change of details and that kind of thing. And we're on our second one, in fact, at the moment. We also have a general power and indeed obligation to explain electoral processes and to encourage people to vote and to understand the process. So I suppose that is very much part of how I see how we fit with your functions and the Democracy Shield generally, so that we have an obligation and a power to research, to educate, and to encourage. They're quite substantial powers and quite substantial demands, I suppose, really.
And maybe just on that research and kind of part of your power, I understand the Electoral Commission published its reviews on the last Dáil and Seanad elections in May and June of this year.
We did. We have a power which we have engaged. We don't have to. We have a power to conduct research and to publish a report following each electoral event. And we've done that. We did it for every electoral event. We did it for the mayoral election in Limerick, the referendums. We did it for the general election. We did it for the Seanad election. They're all on our website. We did them and we looked for various things. Every member of the commission went out and spent time in polling stations. It was a very interesting thing to do. We followed what we regarded as best practice in Europe, or in fact under the OECD projects. And we wrote substantial reports pointing out difficulties. Some of the things might sound like very straightforward, like there's no proper signage, or something that's much less straightforward, there's no proper access. The wheelchair access looks like it's going to be fine, but it turns out there's a step. Or when people go into the polling station, there's no proper signage inside. So we've called those out, and we have found some improvement. And I suppose you could say if we don't spot those problems, then some of our function of encouraging voting and observing the robust nature of the electoral process will be lost, I think.
And maybe going beyond the practicalities of going to vote and the elections, given the focus across Europe on misinformation, disinformation in recent times, given past elections in, say, Moldova and Romania, are there any particular insights and findings that you would highlight from the Electoral Commission's recent framework on the outline of electoral processes, information, political advertising, and deceptive AI content that was published last year?
Do you have all day? There's a lot to say in answer to that. First of all, as you know, under the legislation, there are two parts, parts 4 and 5. I think probably most of your listeners will have heard of these. Part 4 deals with online misinformation regarding electoral processes at the time of elections, and part 5 deals with misinformation, which is deliberate malintended information. And those parts weren't commenced yet. And the reason for that is a bit complex, but it essentially concerns European law, the Digital Service Act, and now the soon to come into force political advertising regulation. It's important that there's harmonisation. And the EU Commission has been engaged with the Irish government around the commencement of those parts and how they dovetail with the DSA and the political advertising regulation. The political advertising regulation is a directly effective regulation. It'll come into force on the 10th of October. You're a bit unlucky because the Commission and government haven't yet agreed who will be the responsible designated authority here. On Commission Laman is the designated authority in general for the Digital Services Act, but there's possibly a subset of information and concern around electoral processes. And so I suppose maybe I'll come back in a few months and talk to you in much more detail about that. These are important. I mean, it's important that we understand what attacks, as it were, there are coming from other countries. But it's also important that there is a way of calling out wrong information. And there was a very simple example, which I think is profoundly important. In Limerick, earlier on in November, in the general election, it seemed to be the case that several polling stations indicated to voters they couldn't vote without their polling card. That has never been the law, and it's never been a regulation. And somebody phoned into a local radio station. We had people monitoring and observing those. And immediately our chief executive went on the radio, local radio, national radio, to say, you don't need your polling card. That makes a difference. So we're a watchdog on the day of elections. We're a watchdog to make sure the processes are happening properly. And in a sense, I think, if the processes aren't happening properly, it doesn't admit of a fair and free election because people are excluded from the process. There'll be much bigger things like that. We're deeply involved in the European discussion around this. We have a number of political scientists working, senior members of staff, in fact, and we're deeply connected to the European networks. We've had training from some of those. There's a big body functioning out of Helsinki, if you want me to give you the name. I had to write it down. But we're engaged with those. We had some assistance from those before our big year last year. There's a seminar, in fact, a very complex seminar starting on Monday. Several of us will go to that. It's online, so we'll dip in and out of it. And we're involved in understanding the European context, but we're also informed by the Irish Cybersecurity Unit. We have a link to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and through them a link to our embassies, who can inform us, sometimes with hard information about where a focus is on our election, but sometimes with just soft information. You know, there's this chat going on, etc. So it's a very complex structure, as it has to be, because it's a very complex problem.
No, absolutely. It's a very interesting answer. And maybe just touching on that European aspect, how do you think the work of the Electoral Commission can feed into the formation and rollout of the EU Democracy Shield? And what maybe, does the Electoral Commission, or you as its chair, have any specific unique insights from Ireland that you could benefit from?
I'll start at the end. The insights from Ireland are useful and interesting, and in fact very positive. We did what we call a NEDS report. We're going to do a survey of electors, what's called a longitudinal study. You know that's not my language, but we're doing that, and we did a survey recently. I brought the results for you to see what the attitude of voters is to elections in Ireland and to see what people know. And the result was astonishing. So 90% of the people who replied said that they understood that every one of their preferences counted. So 80% said that they thought elections were well managed and that election officials are fair. 94% said that the elections were conducted in accordance with the law. Now, interestingly enough, a significant number of the people who didn't vote because of work commitments or because they were away. And one thing we did say, in fact, in our general election survey, our report following that, was that the way in which you can register for a postal vote is not satisfactory. You may not know this. In fact, I didn't know this until we came to look at it. You only have a window of 2 days. This election was called at 4 o'clock on a Friday. If your employer required you to go off to Scotland next week, the window was closed in the 48 hours. You couldn't find your employer. The office of Cork Corporation or Dublin Corporation was closed, and you couldn't sort your voting. So that's one problem. There's another small, but I think highly significant problem. Some people want a postal vote because they're unwell. They need a doctor's cert. They have to pay for the doctor's cert. That's an immediate, you might think small impediment, but all of those small impediments lead, if they become public, if, say, for example, they end up as discussion points on the Joe Duffy show, they end up as some kind of a challenge, some way in which people believe less in the integrity of the system, and they become big topics. It's better that they're sorted, and we've made recommendations. The fee to the doctor be waived, longer time to vote for a postal vote. Postal votes are tricky, of course, because you wouldn't necessarily want everybody to vote by post, because there are security issues. But somebody who knows they're going to be out of the country, or who's told suddenly on the day of the election is counted that they have to go to work somewhere, it should be possible. There was a nice story, actually. Every Superior Court judge in Ireland had to go to a conference on the day of the referendum. They were required by their conditions of employment to attend. None of them could vote as a result. I think there was one judge who voted close enough to drive in the morning, and every one of them had to apply for a postal vote. But it was quite tricky. I mean, they took hours and hours and hours to do it. There were Gardaí involved. And so it possibly is a little bit too difficult. Again, as I say, there's a balance to be drawn.
Yeah, definitely. But those figures from your recent report were very positive.
Why they matter, I think, is this. I think it's really important that we don't over-stress the challenges. There are challenges, but I think it's really important that we also point to the positives. And the positives are Irish people vote, Irish people believe the system is fair. Not everybody votes. There are hard to reach people, and there are people who don't vote. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I think it's good to be positive, and I certainly am conscious of feeding the positive story both to the public in Ireland and internationally. We can't be complacent, but we should be calm and step back and say, how do we preserve this confidence? And I'm anxious that we would do it, and I'm confident that some of the recommendations we make, which will be taken up, I'm satisfied they will just improve that slow, firm confidence in the system.
But it does show a good level of electoral literacy amongst the Irish population.
Yes, strange things that people don't know. We did a lovely visit. We go out at election time and we go to whatever place might be suitable for us to go and hand out leaflets or whatever. We have yellow T-shirts. It's very nice, kind of pleasant event to do it. But Limerick had a direct mayoral election, and that was important. We had a number of functions there. We regarded it as part of our function, not just to encourage people to vote because it's part of our statutory mandate, but also to do radio interviews to explain what a mayor can do. It meant, I think, that the debate in Limerick was very mature. There weren't people saying, oh, if I'm mayor of Limerick, I can build new hospitals.
Yeah.
The debate never became that. But why I'm mentioning Limerick is this. We went around the street, passing out leaflets and whatever. Everybody stops to talk. which is great. And we happened to say to a number of people, do you understand the system and whatever? And this young woman, I suppose in her early 20s, was with her mother. And they were chatting away and they thought voting is very important. And I said, somebody said, do you have any difficulty with the ballot paper and it's very long? And she said, no, that doesn't bother me. She said, it's hard to find somewhere to put my signature. And we all gasped. You put your signature on the ballot paper. And she said, I thought I had to. That was my verification. Now, that's possible. This was an educated girl. Her mother was horrified.
Yeah.
But maybe the word secret ballot has just been lost. You know, of course we know it's secret in the sense that the polling clerk doesn't know what way you voted. But it also means you shouldn't be signing your ballot paper. Small thing, just made sure people knew not to do it.
Yeah, and maybe on that, you know, more broadly, what role do you think the education and public engagement mandate of the Electoral Commission has in countering or even pre-bunking mis and disinformation?
I think education is the key to it all. Education is the key to a proper engagement with politics. It's the key to proper voter behavior. It's the key to encourage people to vote. It's the key to engagement with civil society generally. And it's the key to being part of your country and having confidence in your country. The disinformation, misinformation debate is quite an interesting one, as you know, because we need to be careful to balance freedom of expression with disinformation, misinformation regulation. Too much regulation fails to respect freedom of expression, which is of high constitutional value. I do firmly believe that education, engagement, research, evidence-based research and publications, that counters dis and misinformation to an extent more than anything else can. And I'm a firm believer that our education outreach program and our general research, our website, you have no idea how many people look at the website. It was, I think, 130,000 people on the day of the referendum. On the day of the referendum, people look at our website to find out where their polling station is, what time they're open, but also who the candidates are. Do you need to bring a polling card? What ID do you have to bring? That's all small things like that add up to a robust system and people who are engaged. So I'm conscious of that. We have very good programs. We will roll out more education programs for schools. We couldn't just jump into this. They had to be done in conjunction with both our own internal research, but also with teachers' bodies and students. So we're conscious of that. I think that's one of our key thoughts around this.
And maybe going back to just what you said there on the kind of freedom of expression, the importance in the constitutional setup of the state of that basic right. Do you think in regulating mis and disinformation by, say, the Electoral Commission or other bodies, do you think there's a role for judicial oversight in that, for appeals? And
well, Part 4 and 5 provide for application to the court for a takedown order, as it were, or an amendment order. So yes, I think there is. The problem with that is, I think there's a role for judges or for judicial oversight, as you correctly call it. There's a role for that because the rule of law plays into this. It must. Part of the problem is that some of this misinformation, disinformation, some electoral process wrong information, if I can call it that in a neutral way, some of that comes on the day before the election. It's too late to go to court. It's too late, but by the time the court assesses it. That's what happened in Romania, for example. The election was held and then it was annulled by a court. That could happen here, but that's a nuclear option, to put it mildly. And I was at a conference in Lithuania recently, and there was a lot of discussion around this and regulation. But one of the topics that came up over and over again, particularly in conversations in the margins, because you learn a lot there, is the rule of law demands indeed that there be fairness of process. And so you can't just jump into the High Court, rock down to the High Court, get your order ex parte to stop, to remove something, and do so without notice to the other side. You can't do that. And if you do, it's a failure to reflect the complexities of the application of the law. We did something, as I say, we did that radio interview, the chief executive did that radio interview with regard to needing your polling card to vote. It was a very effective way to do it. There's always radio platforms or our own platforms. We operate Twitter pages. I think we operate an Instagram page. I don't look at that actually, because I suppose I could end up looking at all shoes and handbags and things. But we do that, and we do consciously use the radio. It's a very big medium. The radio's on in the background in people's houses a lot of the day, you know, and it's on in people's cars.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I know that, say, for the referendums, when I did the Morning Ireland programs, like, the number of people who listen, huge numbers of people listen, and listen with some care. So we did an interesting thing. You might remember the referendum on family and care. There were ads, posters, I should say, the day or the 2 days before the referendum, saying the Constitution says that a woman's place is in the home. The Constitution does not say that. And we just published a very short press release to say this is the constitutional text. Because people don't always go back to the Constitution to see what it says. And indeed, the Constitution is not an easy document to read if you're not some way used to reading legal text.
And maybe in that context of big constitutional decisions, we do have a presidential election coming later this year. And I'm just wondering, has the Electoral Commission followed the recent presidential elections in other countries, such as Moldova and Romania, as we previously mentioned? And, have you gathered experience on foreign interference, if it may happen? We have had maybe some insights of foreign advertising from different places.
We have, yeah. Have we followed it? Yes. I mean, as I said, we're deeply engaged with particularly European bodies, both EU bodies and general European bodies, particularly that group working out of Helsinki. And they're very established. They're established over much longer times than us. They're not all electoral commissions either. So we're aware of this. The cybersecurity unit is the Irish Cybersecurity Protection Unit is deeply aware of it, as are the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is feeding us in our embassy. So all of that comes in. We're aware that the presidential election in Ireland, I mean, everybody who's been reading the papers recently will see that the campaign is often regarded as robust, if I want to use a neutral word, and perhaps a number of commentators have said, the campaign is harder than the job. We envisage having a role in perhaps educating people in a general way as to what the president can do and what the president can't do. The president is a supremely important office, and it's largely, but not entirely, ceremonial. But that ceremonial role can sometimes be a role that reflects the values of the people. And that ceremonial role is a role that must be taken very seriously. Equally, the president's powers under the Constitution, are of some significance. The president can refuse to dissolve the Dáil, for example. The president can refer legislation to the Supreme Court for a determination on its constitutionality. The president can decide not to do that, and there are reasons why presidents would decide not to do that. And the president appoints judges and ministers, but the president doesn't make any decision as to who will be a judge. But the judge goes out to the Áras, gets a warrant. That warrant then is sent down to the Chief Justice, and the process is concluded. So if you look on our website, you'll see those elements are identified. So in no sense can the president decide where hospitals are going to be built or how the money of the state is going to be distributed. None of those roles are roles of the president, but the president is still the chief citizen, as it were.
Okay, thank you for that. There was recently a motion introduced into the Dáil and debated, and a similar one also passed in the Northern Ireland Assembly on the extension of the franchise in presidential elections to citizens in Northern Ireland. And I'm just wondering what implications logistically that would have for the work of the Electoral Commission.
Well, first of all, it'll require a referendum, but leaving that aside for a moment, it will of course pose challenges on the structure of the counts, the polling stations. Is everybody going to get on a train down from Belfast? Are we going to have more trains, buses, cars, trucks, helicopters? There's 1.5 million people living in Northern Ireland. I don't know how many of them are over 18, but a lot of them would be. Even if it's only 1 million people who could vote. Logistically, it's tricky, but of course that would have to be sorted. The challenges are just a bigger electorate. And the challenges, I suppose, would be understanding how to reach Northern Irish people in an election like that, because we know how to do it down here. The Electoral Commission, I mean, in particular, our chief executive he's been embedded in Irish government and politics for so long. He knows exactly what radio station to go on, where to publish something. He's a very nuanced view of how the country works. We may not have that knowledge of Northern Ireland. The challenge of who candidates are and things like that, they're political questions. They wouldn't be our questions. We're probably a while away from that, but yes.
Okay, perfect. And I think with that, I'll draw this to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you for inviting me. We'll come back and talk about the political advertising regulation and what happens to parts 4 and 5 when it's clearer, which probably we're talking about another 5 or 6 months, I'd say. Perfect. They're big topics and difficult legal topics.
No, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to
that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.